Hello and welcome to this online short lecture on the working class and their place within the Nazi state. The previous lesson that we've had has already touched on the working class and how they benefited or did not benefit from Nazi economic policies. What we touched on in the previous lesson was that the working class on the one hand did benefit from the Nazis coming to power, and that was because one of the primary focuses of Nazi policy was to reduce this 6 million unemployed figure, which they do over the course of the period 1933 through to 1939. So the workers or the working class who are unemployed or who are threatened by potential unemployment do benefit from Nazi rule. But on the other hand, the working class are subjected to policies which ultimately are going to result in a deterioration in the standard of living. And we looked at that when we studied that little table in the previous lesson, which showed working class consumption of food and drink. And if you look at the 1920s Weimar period and compare it to the 1930s under the Nazis, the working class were consuming less luxury food and drink items. Now that's because there was less supply, but also because working people had less wages. So wages do not increase during this period, and if working class people did want to see an improvement in their wage packets, they had to work longer hours, which also therefore has an impact on their social life. So in terms of the economy, you can decide for yourself if you think that the Nazis, just by offering a job, have improved the lives of the working class. Today I want to touch on not so much the economics of how the working class performed, although we might touch on that now and again, but through looking at these documents here, we're going to focus on where did the working class fit in within Nazi Germany, because we know that their political organisations, the Communist and the Socialist Party, were definitely not part of the Nazi regime, right? They were the enemies of Nazism and nationalism, and we know that the trade union movement was also attacked and removed on May the 1st, 1933 by the Nazis. So where did the working class fit into this new regime? And although the Nazis could easily ban or dissolve working class organisations and movements, they couldn't do away with the working class themselves, right? They are the majority of the population. So the Nazis are, on the one hand, able to use violence and terror to ensure that there is no working class organised opposition, but at the same time they still have to view the working class as an entity very carefully and closely, and there's even some aspects of Nazi policy that you might argue is an attempt to placate or appease the German working class. We shouldn't see the working class as completely being rendered, in some respects, completely redundant from being able to have a position within Germany where they can be completely oppressed and completely exploited and taken advantage of. Their very presence as a social class group means that the Nazis have to view them with some caution. And what I want to do is just introduce you, before we look at these ways that the Nazis actually do appease the working class, I actually want to first of all focus on Nazi interpretations of the working class. And to do so, I'm going to focus on this document here. Now, these are two little extracts, both of them from the exact same date, the 24th of November 1936. This is a few years into the Nazi regime. One is from Colonel Georg Thomas and the other is from Robert Lee. I'll speak a little bit about Robert Lee in a second. What we get in these two little quotations, this comes from a book by the historian Tim Mason, who was the kind of expert historian on the relationship between the working class and the Nazi state. And the reason Mason presents these two quotations from this Chamber of Labour meeting in 1936 is because they give us an insight into how the Nazis thought about the working class. And you kind of get a little sense or a little element of fear within the Nazi party as to what might happen if the working class are treated too harshly. So the first quote from Colonel Georg Thomas says, the total war of the future will make demands on the people on a scale we can hardly imagine. The moral and physical efforts of the First World War, which already placed really heavy burdens on our German people, will be exceeded by far in a future war. So in 1936, the Nazis are very much aware of what the future holds, right? The future holds war. Now, although war had not been planned at this point, although there was no knowledge amongst the German working people that war would eventually be the ultimate aim of the Nazi movement, the Nazi economy has been built, as we spoke about in the previous lesson, it's been built on the premise that everything that is being produced and manufactured is kind of war materials, and we know that the army is increasing in its size as well. So war will come. That is Hitler's ultimate aim, to overturn the terms of Versailles, but also, as you know, to seek Lebensraum in Eastern Europe. So what Thomas is saying here is World War One was too much for the working class within Germany. They eventually stopped giving support to the Kaiser's regime during this 4-year period. We know that the working class suffered greatly due to food shortages, and many Germans died from malnutrition during the war, right? During World War One, that is. So Thomas is saying, do we really want to go down that route again? Because look what happened. What happened at the end of the war? We have this German Revolution. Now, Robert Lee in the second quote makes a very similar point. He expands upon it a little bit more, and he offers a potential solution. Robert Lee is the head of the German Labour Front, right, or the Deutsche Arbeiterfront. You'll see it written down as the DAF here. It's written here. And Lee, therefore, is kind of responsible. It's his job within Nazi Germany to, if you like, look after the German working class, make sure that the German working class feel part of this Volksgemeinschaft, right, this national people's community, that the working class can feel that they are equal to the middle classes and to the kind of more affluent upper classes. Now, in this quotation from Lee, we get a real insight into how the Nazis, as I said, viewed the working class. I'll read through it and I'll focus on a few key points. Lee says, if you demand only sacrifices from a people, something the First World War showed us with all possible clarity, and then you ask the people to hold out, stick out the war. He said that's all well and good, but there is an endurance, right, a limit to the endurance of every individual, and naturally of every people, right? So the working class can only bear so much. They can only bear so much during the First World War, where their lives were basically about survival during the war, because there was so little, especially for the working class, so little food. There was no social life, and all you were getting were bad news stories about the war and family members being killed. So there is a limit to the endurance of the working class, is what Lee's saying. And he says, he gives this little analogy. He says, it's just as with an iron girder or any structure that is supposed to support a load. There's a limit, and when that limit has been reached, everything breaks. And for us, that was 1918, and then he says November 9th to be precise, right? November 9th is the day the Kaiser abdicates. November 9th, 1918 is sometimes seen as the first day of the German Revolution. And what Lee is saying is, look, if you burden the working class with too much work and not enough joy and not enough fun and not enough money, maybe even not enough beer, then you are in danger of provoking something. And what you could provoke is something similar to November 9th, 1918, i.e. revolution. And he says we can be sad about that revolution and be embittered about it. We may curse and swear, but the fact is that the men in power then, so that's the Kaiser's regime, forgot to compensate the people for the enormous strain of those 4.5 years. They forgot, on the other hand, and this is a key idea which is going to be different for the Nazi regime compared to what life was like during the First World War. He says that regime forgot to inject new sources of strength, to pump in new strength again and again. And what, therefore, we are focusing on here is this word strength. The Nazi state was reliant upon the strength of the working class to continue to work, to continue to produce for the benefit of the regime. But you had to revitalise that strength. Workers needed time off, they needed enjoyment, they needed to refocus and switch off. So to do that, this word strength would become part of Nazi policy, right? And the Nazi policy that it becomes part of is what we call the KDF, right? The Kraft durch Freude, or the Strength Through Joy movement. This was a part of the DAF, right? So it's part of the German Labour Front. The KDF was an organisation that the entire working class could join and become part of, and they would benefit from becoming part of this organisation. The Nazis would give the working class people of Germany, in return for their hard work, little perks, little opportunities, sporting activities, holidays, theatre visits, things that we'll talk about in a bit more detail in a second. And the idea was that through joy, right, or enjoyment, the workers would rebuild their strength and then could go back to work and continue to play their part in rebuilding Germany. So that is what we're focusing on today, what we call the KDF. Now, on the one hand, the KDF is this fantastic piece of Nazi propaganda, right, that kind of draws the working class into the regime. On the other hand, the working class, especially those who still have affiliations with or sympathies with communism, socialism, and trade unionism, what actually this is, it brings the working class together. They don't have to accept the regime, but they can take and enjoy parts of the regime that are thrown at them. There is no evidence to suggest that the vast majority of the working class truly ever submit themselves to the regime, that they truly support Nazism. Again, when we look at opposition to the Nazis in a future lesson, you might be able to decide for yourself if you think the working class accepted or opposed Nazism. But I think there's enough evidence to suggest that they will enjoy and take advantage of some of these little benefits. Doesn't mean that they fully embrace this idea or concept of the Volksgemeinschaft, and that they treat the middle classes and upper classes as being, they're kind of fellow members of this Reich. They can still view the middle classes and the upper classes with disdain and class hatred. Now, the Strength Through Joy movement, or the KDF, has two elements to it. One is the KDF, the other is known as the Beauty of Work. That's a kind of sister organisation, the Schöne Arbeit section of the KDF. And before we get to the beauty of labour, I want to focus on the key elements of the KDF. Now, the KDF was, let's go back one, was really an idea that had been stolen by the Italian fascists. Mussolini, back in the early 1920s, had implemented a similar idea to keep the workers content, and he called this the Doppellavora, which was just kind of meant the after-hours clubs. And it went down well in fascist Italy. So the Nazis are kind of borrowing or stealing an idea from fascist Italy. Now, there was some so-called science right behind this idea of the KDF, and I'm going to speak a little bit about it now. There was in the 1930s a survey done by the Siemens organisation, as you know, right, large electrical company in Berlin. They had 42,000 workers. The Siemens company polled these workers. 28,500 of the workers who were polled had stated that they had never been on a vacation. In fact, many of them had said they hadn't even been outside of the Berlin area. So here you've got workers who, it's the same case in Britain, same case in numerous countries across Europe at this point. Workers don't really have leisure time in the way that the middle classes do and upper classes do, and that's what the Nazis wanted to change, right? They wanted to give the working class some more free time, some more leisure, and this in turn would mentally and physically strengthen the working class, who would come back to the workplace rejuvenated. Now, what the Nazis do first and foremost is they increase the amount of days off for the working class, right? The annual kind of average holiday for a German worker was 3 days a year, which I know seems really low, right? 3 days would be, 3 days possibly taken in the summer. You added on to maybe a weekend, and you can have 5 days off. The Nazis double this to 6 days a week, which again does not seem like a lot, but it's actually better than what you see in other parts of Europe at this point. So what we have is now an opportunity for workers to do something with this kind of weeks-long holiday that's available to them. And this organised leave, I guess, on the one hand would give workers more freedom, but on the other hand it actually doesn't, because when they go and join in and enjoy these KDF opportunities, there is a lot of Nazi indoctrination, right? A big part of it is more propaganda. So as you go to theatre, expect it to be theatre that is approved by the Nazis. If you go on a holiday, it's a Nazi approved holiday. I'll give you an example of that in a minute. So what we see is workers taking advantage of what the Nazis offer them. This little document that I've got on the screen here does talk about the beauty of labour, which I'll come back to in a second, but on the second page you get information on the KDF. And this is actually a document for Austrian workers, right? So this is from 1938, once Austria becomes part of the Greater German Reich. And you get some really good information and statistics here that, okay, it's propaganda, right, but we know that this was true, right? The Nazis did offer workers the chance to go on vacations. Long before other European countries were going to Spain or Portugal, the Nazis were allowing its workers to do this in the 1930s. So you have got some good statistics here, right? Over 20 million Germans have participated in KDF trips. That is more than a quarter of the population. 19 million have participated in 60,000 vacation trips within Germany itself. We hear about the KDF cruise ships that have been built. They go to places like Madeira, which is in Portugal, Italy, and through the Norwegian fjords. So these are opportunities for working people that they had never had before. I should say that in some of these ships, right, there's one ship that actually was known as the Robert Lee ship. It had 156 loudspeakers on the cruise ship, constantly churning out Nazi propaganda. But the idea was that, you know, people's lives, which had been gloomy and dull, were now going to be vastly improved by Nazi KDF policies. In fact, I'll just quote very quickly Robert Lee. Lee says, "Strength through joy has multiple objectives," right? So what he says is, "From boredom springs stupid, heretical, yes, in the end, criminal ideas and trains of thought. Gloomy dullness makes people complain, gives them a feeling of homelessness. In a word, the feeling of absolute superfluity, i.e. they regard themselves as being useless. Nothing is more dangerous to the state than that." So the Nazi idea, what we usually say is, keep people active. They're less likely to question what is going on within Germany. They're less likely to question Nazi policies. So that is the essence of the KDF movement. And on My City, you can read a little bit more about some of the kind of KDF policies. It's not just holidays, right? Where in 1934, 2.3 million Germans go on a cruise. By 1938, 10.3 million. So it's a major increase in those going on holiday. But it's not just about holidays. It's about activities in general. And one of the so that involves theatre visits. I should say that when the working class started to go to theatre visits, the kind of upper classes and the middle classes started to kind of look down their nose. They thought that this was high culture for their social class, not for the workers. Hitler and the Nazis were quite happy for the working class to go to the theatre. Hitler had done this himself as a young man in Vienna. He would go to the opera frequently. But there was still a kind of snobbishness, and so what you ended up getting was not a proper Volksgemeinschaft where working class and middle class people were going to theatre at the same time. That wasn't the case. Working class people were going to the theatre at times that had been set up for them by their place of work. So we're kind of going there as a kind of block booking. Theatre at night was still obviously more so for the affluent. What I want to touch on here, however, is something much more dramatic, and that is the idea that the working class, every German, but the working class, could own their own automobile, their own car. And what you see in Nazi Germany is quite unique, right? But as you might be aware, right, in the United States in the 1920s, working class people were already getting a chance to maybe buy a car because the Ford motor car in the United States was pretty cheap and could be bought with higher purchase, so you basically pay your car up over the course of years. So that's it again, kind of borrow that idea, but this is going to be a state-built car, built by the Nazi state for the German people. And this little car here, your little Nazi car, you'll still see these on the road now and again, the Volkswagen Beetle, is a creation of the Nazis. It was actually invented by Mr. Porsche, as this document here tells us, a small car for the working class. And there was lots of questions in the British press, right? This comes from the Manchester Guardian. How are the Nazis affording to build these cars and then sell them to the German population? Well, there was a bit of a trick to this, right? before World War II breaks out, nobody had been given a Volkswagen. What happens was, and you can see this in the background, workers paid a section or a segment of their wages every week or every month. They got a stamp in the place. They put their stamp into this stamp book here for the KDF wagon, right, or the Volkswagen as it's now known, right, the people's wagon, the people's car. And when they'd completed the stamp book, they would hand it over and they would get their car. But nobody had completed the stamp book by the time the war breaks out. This was great for the Nazis because they were actually taking a chunk of a worker's wage back off them and giving them nothing in return. Now, if the Nazis had won the war, or if the war hadn't broken out in 1939, maybe workers would have gotten these cars because they were built. It's just that during the war they were actually used as military vehicles rather than cars for families to use on these massive autobahns. So you can see in this statement here in 1938 that a minimum weekly payment of 5 marks would be paid on a regular basis, and eventually a car would be given out. So this was a fairly clever Nazi propaganda, but also policy that definitely was alluring to the working classes. Okay, final thing I want to touch on, which I mentioned earlier on, is the beauty of labour movements. We'll go back to this document here. The beauty of labour, sometimes referred to as the dignity of labour. Similar idea to the KDF in general, this idea of improving the lives of the working class, was to improve the workplace. So that would mean nice clean canteens. It might involve having showers, spaces within factories, swimming pools as you can see here, sports facilities, better ventilated working conditions. All of these elements placed into a factory setting would make the factory a more desirable place for the worker to go, but not just a place where the worker would expend energy, but could also revitalise themselves if they use the swimming pool, if they use the sports facilities. On the one hand, this seems quite a modern, advanced idea that the Nazis have, and some of these views were actually taken on board in Japan post World War II, and the Germans themselves have went back to a lot of these ideas post World War II as well, where workers feel that, you know, their place of work is more than just somewhere where they go, give their time, get money in return. So there's always this element of propaganda. The more time you spend within Nazi organisations or with Nazi institutions, the more the regime thinks that they have got a hold of you, and the more they think that you are attached to that regime. Again, we don't know for sure how many of the working class really felt that they were now part of this German Volksgemeinschaft, or whether or not, as I said, they were just exploiting these opportunities for a slightly better way of life, especially when we consider that the working class had lost the political parties that they voted for, and that they had lost opportunities to campaign for better wages through their trade union movement. Now, let's go back to the very first question that I said to you in the previous lesson in order to summarise. 2 points, 2 questions. Is the Nazi regime based on popular support or terror and coercion? Well, here is evidence that you could use or apply to argue that it is maybe based on popular support. Even if the Nazis are trying to manipulate the working class, it doesn't matter, right? They're not using terror, they're not using violence. They're saying, here are the benefits of living under the Nazi regime. You can enjoy all of these things that people in other European countries of the working class, let's say in Britain or France or Spain, that they cannot enjoy. The other question is linked to, again, what we spoke about in the previous lesson. Who really benefits from Nazi rule? Is it all social classes or just some social classes? Here is more evidence that you can use to weigh up in this discussion about, you know, how did the working class fare under Nazism. So in the kind of positive column, you might have workers have got a job, and now you might add to that the benefits of the KDF movement and the beauty through work element of that. In the negative column, you might say, well, here's evidence of more propaganda being thrust upon the German working class, and you might add to this the other things that we spoke about: less money, longer hours, and no political or trade union representation. there's information, I guess, or evidence that you could place in both columns. But keep those questions, both of those questions, in mind. Okay, there are more extracts that you can read about the working class and how they fared on My City. One particular interesting section that I would like you to look at is from the historian Timothy Mason, who I mentioned earlier. And Mason argues that the working class still were able to hold on to some economic power under the Nazi regime. And there's a little example on My City about the working class in Hamburg and how the working class, when they kind of remained united, not in terms of political goals or political ideas, but in terms of almost as a kind of economic group, they could still cause a threat to Nazism. Okay, that's all. Thank you very much.